Yep.
Okay, hey there, hello, and my name's Ted Smith, and welcome everybody to Hempology 101. It's really good to be here again.
Yoo-hoo! Whoops.
So, yeah, I guess this is the 8th year that we've done this free non-credit lecture, and I guess I'll admit I've been a little bit scattered this year because I have finally published my textbook for Hempology 101, something I've worked on now for 17 years. Okay, turn that a bit too. And so I haven't been busy promoting the lecture series as much as I have been promoting my book. And actually, we didn't even confirm the room until today, so I haven't put the posters out and promoted it much. But this is going to be a really exciting year for our lecture series. I plan on having a lot of guest speakers up here teaching and sharing what they know about cannabis and prohibition. And certainly expanding from the half hour to an hour will give us more time to really get into some subjects like today's subject, the ancient history of cannabis, which is really a huge topic. I could do a lecture series, an entire semester on the ancient history of this plant. And many of the other lectures we teach are similar. And just to kind of highlight some of the people speaking this semester, we do our chemistry lesson where Dr. Paul Hornby comes here and does a whole hour lecture on cannabis and cannabinoids. And we also have Sean come up from Hemp & Company, a large hemp store downtown, and I think this semester he talks about hemp products. Gail usually does a talk from the Cannabis Buyers Club. Probably this year it'll be on medicinal cannabis products, and she's got a lot of history herself of dealing with those things. And this year as well, I'm sort of introducing my sort of next professor for Hempology, because by the end of the semester, Gail and I are going to be going around teaching Hempology at other campuses. In fact, we're flying to Nova Scotia, to Halifax, and we're going to start up Hempology clubs at Dalhousie. We already have a club at Mount Allison University in New Brunswick, and then we're going to get clubs going at Ottawa and the University of Toronto as well. And so we're really excited about expanding Hempology far beyond Victoria. But certainly this is our home base, and like I say, I got my friend Ryan Fink, who's going to be doing the last lecture of the semester here, and more in the future when we're not around. But yeah, so I guess I'm gonna just dive right into the ancient history of cannabis, and I thought to make today's focus around cannabis as the tree of life.
Awesome.
Because it is my understanding, and other historians, like my friend Chris Bennett, he's written this book here, Cannabis and the Soma Solution. He's written another book called Sex, Drugs, Violence in the Bible, and his first book is Green Gold, The Tree of Life, Marijuana and Magic and Religion. So he's got 3 books on the history of cannabis, and he's really taught me and others a lot about the historical uses of this plant, and why it was known as the tree of life in a number of ancient societies, not just the Judeo-Christian traditions that we would normally associate with the tree of life. But the tree of life goes back far beyond Judeo-Christian history and to many other cultures and civilizations. And I'm going to explain to you why, and then why the tree of life and the tree of knowledge of good and evil was then banned. But we do have a second lecture on the history of prohibition next semester, so I'll get more into the prohibition end of it there and talk more about its uses here. And so it's my firm belief, and others, that we've been using the cannabis plant, eating it essentially first, for millions and millions of years. This is not a plant that showed up in the 60s. It's my belief that the predecessor of both cannabis and humans, like 50 million years ago, or at some point after the dinosaurs are basically extinct, due to whatever was happening on the planet, but most likely the end result was a long period of ice ages where we would have been living in very small pockets in places that would have had very short growing seasons. And it was during these time periods that we got to know cannabis for its seed. It wasn't for its intoxicating purposes at all. It had nothing to do with the leaf, had nothing to do with the stalk. I am positive that what basically turned us on to cannabis the first time was coming across a bunch of basically dead plants in the fall. And I've seen a hemp field about 3 weeks ago. We were in a hemp field in Saskatchewan, and it's really quite amazing, although it's obviously been developed to where it is now. But the hemp plant is really good at a couple of things, and one of them is seed production. We've developed plants now that produce not only by mass about 30% of its weight in seed, but they also grow very tall and produce a lot of biomass, certainly compared to other plants. And today we don't need to use herbicides because cannabis or hemp outgrows the other plants. So it doesn't kill the other plants, it just grows so fast it smothers them out and they don't get any more sunlight. And essentially when you grow hemp or cannabis in the wild, you don't need to try to kill the other plants because cannabis will do that for you. And so it's my belief that we would have come across these probably small but dead plants. So they would have fallen over on the ground. They would have been full of seed. Because back when we were not much smarter than squirrels, we would have gone around and found every source of food that was available. And we would have been looking for nuts and seeds. That would have been something that we recognized as being a good food source. And there's lots of archaeological evidence to show that actually like seeds and nuts were much bigger part of our diet than we might think. We would always think we kill to eat, so we eat mostly animal fat protein. Well, that I don't think was the case. It's really hard to kill, but it's really a lot easier to harvest. And so one of the first intelligent things that we started to do is to harvest seeds and things that we could eat over the winter time and store easily over the winter time. And hemp seed is not that hard to store. It will stay viable for several years if it's just basically kept dry and cool, which during ice ages wouldn't have been very hard. If things weren't melting, it wouldn't have been hard to store hemp seed for decades. They probably could have been saved and kept later. And I'm quite convinced that for however many ice ages we've had for the last 50 million years, that hemp seed was a really critical part of our survival through those time periods, because hemp seed contains all the essential fatty acids and amino acids that you need to basically sustain yourself. You could live off of 1 handful of hemp seeds a day. 2 handfuls of hemp seeds a day would give you enough energy and protein to actually work hard for the day. Do you have a question? They don't taste that great, really. They don't taste bad. It's kind of an acquired taste. It's kind of a light, nutty, kind of oily taste in a way. Similar to peanut butter if you grind it up. It's not a lot different than peanut butter. They have like hemp nuts or hemp butter these days. It's just basically ground up seed, yeah, it's in a way it's kind of tasteless. But as a vegetarian, I've been a vegetarian for 16 years, it's great because you can put it on just about anything and it doesn't change the taste. So it doesn't make it taste like hemp or really change it from what it should taste like. But I'm quite convinced that throughout these various ice ages, we learned to store hemp seed because we could eat it over the winter time, and very small amounts of it would be able to keep us alive through the day. There's actually some suggestions that Buddha stayed alive for 6 years before his enlightenment by just eating 1 hemp seed a day. The theory being that he was pure enough in spirit and mind that he didn't need much food, but he needed something. But just 1 seed a day was enough to keep him going. But certainly in ancient times, we would have discovered that hemp seed could last over the winter time, that it was really good for us. But secondly, we would have learned how easy it is to grow, that you really just need to spread a few seeds on the ground in spring, and by the fall you're going to have a nice big field come up, and you're going to have your seed, replenished 1,000-fold from what you put into the ground. And so just the sheer volume of production of this plant really is a stark contrast to most other plants. And so I'm certain that the earliest humans would have been growing hemp seed and learning how to cultivate it agriculturally for millions and millions of years. In fact, now evidence is showing that we've been using tools for probably more like 3, 4, maybe 5 million years. And so, the archaeological history that maybe I was taught in school is really being questioned now in terms of like how long we've been smart enough to develop certain practices like fire. We've had fire in our hands for about 1 million years. And but before we used it as fiber, it's hard to say whether or not we used it as rope, because I'm certain that not only would we have found these hemp plants on the ground, and that if you bang them a little bit, the seeds would pop out very easily, and then you could collect the seeds. But the next thing that they would discover, that when they were smacking the hemp plants on the ground, that the stalk would break up. And the stalk is made up of two things. It's got fiber on the outside and sort of a cork or herds on the inside. And so the fiber is incredibly strong. It's one of the strongest fibers, natural fibers, that we can grow. It's not the strongest, but it's up there. And so they would have learned that when they're banging these things, that they were left over with fiber. And it's not known whether it was the first rope. It's hard to prove anything like that. But certainly it wouldn't have been very long for them to discover that they could twist the hemp fibers around, and all of a sudden they got rope. And that rope would have been incredibly important for a number of things. Certainly building material would have been one of the main and first uses of the hemp plant, that we would have used it to tie sticks together, and otherwise sticks basically to build homes where there weren't caves. And so I'm quite certain that the hemp plant was instrumental in building the first houses. Again, it's hard to find archaeological evidence for any of these things, but it is known that hemp was also used in some of the first concrete that's ever been produced in the world. Lime has been produced out of limestone for a very long time. And I said you can break up the stalk into fiber and hurd or cork. But you can take that hurd and mix it with lime and water, and you can end up making basically a concrete. Actually, if you add sand, it's even stronger. And it would have been very early on in our industry that we learned how to make these kinds of walls. And they're in fact discovering now that some of the ancient walls in Egypt and other parts of the world actually have got cannabis in the building material, because it helped make it stronger. But another one of the earliest industrial applications of hemp is also in pottery. Apparently some of the earliest pottery in Taiwan and in Eastern Asia has hemp fiber in the pottery to help keep it stronger, and then hemp string on the outside to decorate it. They would twist the string around in circles and things like that to make it look nice. And so certainly hemp has been used as a building material for a very long time. But obviously we would have thrown it on a fire too. Like I say, we've had fire in our hands for about 1 million years. It wouldn't have taken very long for someone to throw a whole plant on the fire and see what it does. And if it wasn't an enclosed situation, you have essentially what we know today as a hot box. And hot boxing, believe it or not, is one of the longest lasting human traditions that we have. We've been hot boxing for, like I say, probably close to 1 million years now. Although the old way of doing it isn't quite like what we would do now. In the old methods of doing it, say like the Scythians. I don't know if you've heard of the Scythians before, but they were nomadic peoples that lived sort of in southern Russia and kind of Eastern Europe and down towards kind of the top of the Middle East. And the Scythians developed a method of hotboxing where they made these little tents that were close to the ground, and it was similar to the North American sweat lodges, where instead they wouldn't actually have a fire inside these hot boxes, but they'd bring in like super hot rocks, and then they would throw the cannabis plants on the rock that would essentially like either burn or even vaporize the cannabis that would come in contact with the rock, and then it would make the seeds heat up and they would sort of pop. And so oh, I gotta sign that if you're playing.
How much are the...
Yeah, so the Scythians would have just threw the whole plant on there, seeds and everything, and they apparently the Greeks would write about how they would love to hear the seeds popping on the rock when they were in their little hot boxes. And so I say that because I'm quite certain that the incense that was burned in the ancient temples was in fact hash. Because, like I say, back in the old day, we would have used the cannabis plant for seed production. And so in the fall, when we would have, had the plant, harvested when it was dried, we would have been trying to pick out the seeds out of the plant. And if you ever played with a dried cannabis plant, one of the first things you notice is you start getting finger hash. And it gets all over your hand. And so if you play with enough of it, you can just rub it off there, and all of a sudden, like, you've got something that's full of THC, as about as potent as you could get, and it would make really good hash. And they could have come up with this really good hash millions of years ago, because THC is THC. And even though we have stuff that produces more THC now, there's no doubt that back then, it would have had THC in it. In fact, THC is probably what helps it be an insecticide and help the plant's immune system. They actually don't know why else the plant would produce it if it weren't for its own immune system. There's no other good reason for it to create THC. And so that hash, again, that we would have been making a million years ago, it would have been in small amounts, but it would have had a very powerful effect upon people. And back then, we weren't sort of academic about everything. We were quite the opposite. We were very religious about things. And I'll get to why we were religious in a second here. But we attributed everything that occurred to a god or goddess that was in control of the situation, that either gave us knowledge or brought something into creation, right? Like, humans weren't responsible for everything. It was all very magical. The world was very magical, to ancient peoples. And instead of trying to figure out logically why anything happened, they would just say, oh, it's this goddess or this god, or maybe even in ancient times just one god or goddess. Most historians would believe that, in fact, until 10,000 years ago, it really was one goddess that was sort of worshipped throughout the world, that we didn't have the kind of polytheistic ideas that we do today. But certainly, we attributed knowledge and experience to these other deities. And so it was something where, Mother Nature, essentially was given credit for creating the plant. And so in ancient times, angels and messengers of these gods or goddesses were said to appear in front of people's eyes. And so, in fact, many of us believe that those forms would be plants or animals or mushrooms or something in the physical world that we would say is a manifestation of this god or goddess. And when we consumed these plants, we would attribute our experience to these gods or goddesses entering into us and making us, feel better or become more enlightened. And so we would have noticed upon our first experience a difference in our perception. Again, a million years ago, or whenever it was that we first inhaled some cannabis smoke. And it would have immediately triggered a reaction. We were accustomed to eating it. And so actually all vertebrae have got what's called an endocannabinoid system because we've been eating it for so many millions of years. I didn't get into the science of the endocannabinoid system, but we have essentially, the same chemicals that the cannabis plants in all of us. They're chemically the very same and that's because we've been eating it for so long. But as soon as we smoked it, it would have triggered our receptors in our brain and throughout our body in a completely new way. And it would have been revolutionary for us, and really, changed a lot of our habits in many ways. Recreating that experience would have been very important to early humans, and sharing that experience would have been really important to early humans, because it would have been seen as something beneficial, something new, something exciting. And people like to not only experience new things, but to share that with their friends, right? So, that would have been something that millions of years ago we told our tribe, we shared it, and we cultivated the cannabis plant for thousands of years while we developed religion. Now, so that by the time we started to live in large societies of tens of thousands of people, the cannabis plant really was behind our economy in a bunch of different ways. As I mentioned, we learned to build with it. Well, we also learned to weave with it. The first weaving probably was with the whole stalk. We probably took the cannabis plant and just weaved the whole damn thing together into a mat and put it on the floor, because it would have been really good flooring to use, because A, it's so damn tough. It's tougher than any other plant that's out there. So like I say, the first carpets would have been weaved out of hemp, and gradually we would have learned to build better and better rugs and carpets out of hemp as well. And so the root of canvas, actually, yeah, go ahead. We can make juice out of the plant as well. Yeah. We haven't been doing that. That's a very new thing. But actually, funny enough, Gail and I were at the hemp farm a few weeks ago, and we juiced some when we were out there. So it is certainly possible. Whether it's as psychoactive as eating it, though, is questionable. But it would have different medical properties. It's not the same. But that's a whole new area to get into. But back in the day, we would have basically we would have done the same thing, except we would have chewed it and spit it out, right? We would have learned not to eat the whole thing, because it actually makes you shit pretty hard. We would have chewed it and got the juice out of it and the seed and everything. And then, much like cows, chew grass and spit it out, we would have done the same thing to the hemp plant. But as I say, we really developed a lot of our religious traditions around the use of hashish. But I would also suggest that the other most important sort of plant drug, if you would call it that, is the magic mushroom. In fact, it's my belief that in the Bible, the reference to the tree of knowledge of good and evil is in fact a reference to the magic mushroom, because the magic mushroom has such a powerful effect on the body, much more than using cannabis would have, at any point, really. Magic mushrooms have a very profound effect. And certainly millions of years ago, when we were scavenging, like I say, coming out of ice ages, we would have been trying to eat everything that we could have in order to live. Rather than starve to death, we would have tried mushrooms and roots and all sorts of other things in order to survive. And so it's my belief that 50 million years ago, we ate a magic mushroom, and it gave us an awareness about ourselves, about others, and about our natural environment that we had never experienced before. So again, like some of the things that humans love to do are recreate fun experiences and share it with their friends. So we would have been sharing what we knew about magic mushrooms, millions and millions of years ago. In fact, mushrooms were probably what we learned to cultivate before anything else, or at least how the cycle worked, because it would have been very important to us to learn, when mushrooms became available and how to use them properly. And so there would have been traditions developed around the magic mushroom. In fact, it's also believed that magic mushrooms and cannabis were instrumental in developing our language, because we would have come up with new words to explain the experience, and would have been communicating with others about what was happening and what we were doing in a way that would have enhanced our language and cultural experience. And so for millions of years, we've been using magic mushrooms, attributing the knowledge and awareness, to the mother goddess, essentially, and living a very, good and natural, though very tough life for, again, those millions of years until, like I say, about 1 million years ago, when we started to use fire. And at that point, we started to make hash. And so hash changed everything in different ways, because it became a few thousand years ago, or up until a few thousand years ago, it was the most valuable commodity that we had, because it couldn't grow everywhere. And so there were some regions that didn't have very much hash. So say, for example, Egypt. The Egyptians used a lot of hash in their ceremonies. I got pictures. I really meant to bring it. I spaced out, but the Egyptians used to pile hash on top of their head, and they'd mix it with some other oils and things to make it smell pretty and sort of melt. But they'd also sort of put a band of gold around their head, so that when the hash melted, the oil would basically stay in their hair on the top of their skull and absorb directly into their bloodstream through the top of their head. And so the Egyptians, they'd also they had these funny little sticks that they would put a burning ember of hash on and stick it under your nose with. But they also had incense burners. And as we developed, in larger societies, we would obviously use hemp for everything. As I said, the earliest clothing is all made out of hemp, canvas, and earliest ropes and stuff like that, building materials. We would have used the seed. We pressed the seed. We could have used the oil to burn in lamps and stuff like that. So we had, but also, again, we learned to collect this hash and sell the hash. And so that became incredibly valuable as larger civilizations developed throughout the world. And in fact, some suggest that the hash making technologies developed in part on how long it took to get it to Egypt, because Egypt for the longest time was the biggest market for hash. And there would be all these trading routes from the Middle East, from the mountains of Afghanistan and from Lebanon and such, and those trading routes were very valuable because if you own those trading routes, you get paid off a chunk of hash or something when people went through, and otherwise, if you could grow it in the area as well, the closer you were to Egypt, the more profitable it was. And so there would have been huge hash fields in all the ancient civilizations of the world. The one that I know the most about really is Assyria. Although people don't know much about Assyria, except it is known that the Assyrians had the Jewish people or the Hebrew people in captivity for several hundred years. Thanks for coming. And the Assyrians worshipped cannabis as the tree of life, because it in many ways meant everything to them. It fed them, it kept them in food, it kept them in clothes, and it kept them in hash for their ceremonies. And so in ancient times, they would have had these hash burning altars. They actually got one of these, an Assyrian hash burning altar in the museum. It's actually the BC Museum's most expensive artifact, but they don't really even know what it was used for, because they'll say it wasn't obviously used for sacrificing animals, because it's in a bowl or a cup, and if you're going to sacrifice animals, you want the blood to drain out, or otherwise there'll be a lot of disease because the blood will pool. But these altars were made to burn hash, and they would have used what are now called Nepalese temple balls, which have been used for thousands and thousands of years. Essentially, they'd roll the hash up into, kind of like tennis balls or golf balls, and they would burn it much like charcoal on a barbecue in these altars. Once they got it going, they'd mix it up with a few other things to help it keep burning. But they'd have the smoke just pouring off of these altars, and as the temple balls burnt up, they would just throw new ones on there, and essentially they would hotbox the room of religious ceremony. And so this is where Moses and others would write about communicating to God through the cloud of smoke that would appear in the incense temple. Well, essentially that's them saying that they went in and got high off the hash, and it made them communicate more with their inner self. That's essentially what they're saying that the use of cannabis did. And so cannabis was used not only for its incense purposes, but it was also used as an anointing oil. Cannabis is an amazing plant. It will affect you whether you eat it, smoke it, or apply it on your skin. And so the anointing oil that Moses was taught to make back in ancient times contained 7 pounds of cannabis in it. And they would make this batch of anointing oil to initiate the people into the priesthood. And so what they would literally do, and again, this is in kind of the ancient Hebrew times. They would have a temple that would be usually built facing the south, in the sort of the center of the village or the town, and it would be built up on a high platform. So they'd have sort of like a little mini pyramid, and the top of the pyramid would be where the priests would have their temple. And so inside that temple, they would be burning, hash when they were initiating someone. And then the other thing that they would do would be they would get the initiate to wear a big white robe, and they wouldn't let them shave their head or their beard off. And so when the person was being initiated into the priesthood, they would be, hotboxing the place. They would have fed them probably some bang, which is cannabis cooked in milk with some honey added to it. So they would have been, feeding them some cannabis, getting them stoned. But then they would have took this vat of olive oil with, again, 7 pounds of cannabis cooked into it, and they would pour it slowly over the priest's head, trying to essentially just soak them in this oil, soak their hair, soak their robe, and that they would become, in a way, these kind of glowing, enlightened representatives of God. And the priest would then kind of spin them around a few times, say a few things, sing a few songs, and then at noon they would get them out to step out to the sort of the top of the square and look out over the promenade, where they would have invited all the villagers to come to see this new priest being initiated. And they would have appeared to be essentially what was called the Son of God, because they were glowing. They had olive oil, which makes you glow in a yellow sort of anyway, and you were from the sunlight shining on you, and just you'd have a pretty good glow on from the all the incense that you were inhaling and what else you consumed, let alone what you got coming through your skin. And so the person that was being initiated would really feel as though God and had entered into them. It would be a very unique experience. They would be feeling fantastic, honestly, and it would be very easy for the priesthood, the established priesthood, to convince the new initiate that the reason that you feel so good right now is because God has entered into you. And they would be convinced that this experience was a religious experience. It wasn't from any theoretical or from any theoretical perspective. It was a pure and simple religious experience, that you're being told that God is entering into you, and that you are a son of God from that point forward. And so that was the way that priests were initiated into the Hebrew traditions. Unfortunately, and again I'll do a class next semester on prohibitions, by the time of Jesus, that anointing oil was not allowed to be used among the general population, and was only used by the priesthood for this religious ceremony. So when Jesus was going around sharing the anointing oil and all of its medicinal properties, he was actually breaking strict traditions that would not allow this very beneficial healing oil to be used among the public. It was only to be used in the initiation ceremony of the Jewish priesthood. And that was one of the taboos that he broke when he was sharing this very potent and very important anointing oil. And so I wanted to talk more about the tree of life, because the Babylonians worship cannabis as the tree of life. The Egyptians mention it as the tree of life. Certainly the Assyrians do as well. What's up?
Sanskrit has 120 phrases to describe cannabis.
That's right, yes, I forgot. Sanskrit has 120 different words to describe the cannabis plant.
No phrases.
Because it was used in so many different ways and for so many different purposes. It's really very intertwined into ancient civilization. And so the Assyrians, if you look at their what's left of them, and there really isn't much left. They're pretty much one of the most hated civilizations on the planet because they controlled one of the routes to Egypt from the mountains. Well, I was going to say earlier, the development of hash making techniques depended on how far away you were from Egypt. The further away from Egypt, the more you'd want to get the water out and get it down to just the trichomes of THC. And because it had to be transported for so long, the closer you were to Egypt, the lazier people were in the way that they made it and packed it, because it wouldn't have to be transported as long. And so that's one reason why there's just so many different ways of making hash in the ancient world. But yeah, the Assyrians existed in sort of northern Iran and Iraq. And they took over a lot of the trading routes that were going from the mountains and the Himalayans and stuff into Egypt. And they controlled those trading routes very fiercely. And the Hebrew people or Jewish people were one of a number that were captured and enslaved by them. And they were forced to grow a lot of cannabis for the Assyrians. And the Assyrians worshipped cannabis as the tree of life in a way that no other society has. And this was like, let me think, I think it was about 1100 BC that the Assyrians really rose to power, and it was about 700 BC that they were taken out. So they're only around dominating the Middle East for about 400 years. But they had a really good run of it. And you can see in the leftover hieroglyphics that they worship the tree of life, on a daily basis. And they have this really nice sort of stylized tree that it doesn't look very closely to a cannabis plant. I'd really like somebody to kind of do a visual progression of cannabis in its imagery, because the tree of life does represent many things to many people, but certainly in the earliest times, I believe it did represent the cannabis plant. But it's really hard to draw a pot plant, let alone do it in stone, right? So they had to stylize it and make it kind of look nice. And so you can see in these Assyrian hieroglyphics images where they have the tree of life in large gardens. They have images where the king is collecting resin from these trees, where they have other deities. In particular, they have a winged god with an eagle head collecting this resin. And they have really no good explanation for what this tree of life might be. If they would have considered the cannabis plant, historians, I would like to think that they would recognize it as being the most likely candidate. But the tree of life was worshipped, by the king of Assyria, because it basically drove their economy. And the more that they grew and the more they processed, the stronger the Assyrians were. And so, and again, they worshipped this plant as the tree of life. I forget, they had a few gods. I forget which god they attributed the plant to. But right after they escaped from the Assyrians, the Jewish people were held in captivity by the Babylonians. Again, another civilization that worshipped cannabis as the tree of life. And so it was actually in captivity that they wrote the Bible and put together the Old Testament, and condemned the tree of knowledge of good and evil as being what made us, kind of aware in the first place. But then they actually forbade us from using the tree of life and the knowledge, or the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Which, if you read the script, doesn't make sense, because the tree of life didn't do anything, right? It was just there, and the tree of knowledge of good and evil was what woke people up. Well, really, in my opinion, the symbology in this, and I'll get into this again next semester a bit more, but it really reflects more the traditions we have of using plant medicines, and of, in particular, women knowing how to use these plant medicines more than men. And until a few thousand years ago, most leaders in religion and in culture were women. They weren't men. Men would go out and kill shit. That was our job, right? We protect the village. We, maybe kill other people if we had to. But when it came to understanding foods, when it came to understanding medicines, when it came to understanding how the body worked, well, that was left to women. Women were the ones who made those discoveries. They were the ones who learned and shared knowledge, who developed the language around using plants and other things as medicine. And so, in certain ways, I guess, rebellion against the tree of knowledge of good and evil and the tree of life was an attempt by a bunch of men, essentially, to blame women and these plants and these other gods and goddesses that the Assyrians and the Babylonians worshipped, who used these various trees for knowledge and power. It was their way of sort of blaming all of them for the continued enslavement and problems that the Jewish and Hebrew people had experienced, because they could only, in their minds, blame another god or goddess. They didn't want to blame theirs for it. And so by stopping their worshippers from using the tree of life and the tree of knowledge of good and evil, it was their way of not acknowledging the power that these other gods and goddesses or deities had. And it was also a way of trying to promote their religion as being more sophisticated, that they wouldn't use any of these plant drugs, that they get their revelation directly from God, and that using these various trees or plant medicines was something that was no longer needed, that was in our innocent Garden of Eden time period, but that was long past, and that those trees and those traditions should be left behind, because that was their way of explaining why, again, they'd been punished so often. But at the time, the Jewish and Hebrew people were really a small minority. At the time, cannabis 2,000 years ago was being used around the planet, essentially, with very few exceptions. It doesn't seem like cannabis was in Central or South America very much, but there were cannabis plants in North America. We have records of some of the earliest explorers in Canada coming down the St. Lawrence River and recognizing hemp growing along the riverbanks. Now, it was very low potent. It would, in terms of not being good to produce hash at all, but it was smoked in very small amounts by some of the indigenous peoples in central North America here. But certainly not even as much as say tobacco. But it was used in that. But throughout Europe, cannabis has been used actually more for hemp for a very long time, and for hemp seed, than for the actual intoxicating benefits. Gruel is a food that was eaten. It was sort of a porridge for millennium. Monks apparently would eat gruel 3 times a day. Well, gruel is actually hemp seed, basically like cooked with maybe a couple other things and made into a porridge. And ironically, the monks were able to live quite well when other people were suffering quite a bit, because they had this just constant source of hemp food in their gruel. And so certainly in Europe, the use of hemp seed as a fuel or as a food, and the use of the fiber for rope and building material goes back a very long time. Also in Africa, there's a lot of well, some people speculate that the plant's history began in Africa. There's actually a pygmy community in Africa. I forget exactly which country they live in, but they eat cannabis. They make rope out of it, and they claim that they've been doing that since the beginning of time. Obviously, they don't know when that is, but it's so ingrained in their culture, it's hard to believe it hasn't been happening for tens of thousands of years. Again, at least since the last ice age. The oldest water pipe in the world was made in Ethiopia. There's a lot of evidence to suggest that Africa really is the home of the cannabis plant. But again, it's been used for so long, it's hard to say. In ancient China, the cannabis plant was used not so much for its intoxicating effects as for the seed and again the fiber. In fact, China is where we first developed paper. As I mentioned, we have there's two parts of the stalk. There's the fiber on the outside and then the cork on the inside. It was actually just last century that we started making paper out of the cork. And it made the plant a lot more valuable. Actually, next week's lesson on the Marijuana Tax Act, I'll get into that. But thousands of years ago, we started making the very first paper that the Chinese did using the fiber on the outside, just basically breaking it up and putting it into a silk screen and letting it dry and making paper out of it. So the world's oldest paper is out of hemp. And again, it's hard to prove whether the oldest clothing was or not, but many of us believe that the oldest clothing in the world was also produced in China. It was also made out of hemp. Hemp has been a really important part of the Chinese economy like forever, and it still is. They still use it in all of its various forms. This fiber board here I got is from China, for example. Most of the clothing I'm wearing is from China. We produce a lot of seed here in Canada, but not much out of it, unfortunately, at this point. But yeah, China historically was also known as the land of mulberry and hemp, because it has been used for so very long there. Again, they lost or cut down most of their trees a long time ago and killed all their animals, so they had to use something to make clothing, because they didn't have fur left a couple thousand years ago. There wasn't much of that around anymore, so they had to start making their own clothing and building materials as well. And so, in fact, ancient Chinese medicine doctors would wrap, I think it was a dead snake around hemp stalks, and when they were going to do their Chinese medicine doctor sort of healings, right, where they would fill people up with medicines, they would dance around the bed and beat these hemp plants and dead snake around while they were singing songs. And the modern day symbol for the medical industry, you see a staff with a snake wrapped around it. Well, that actually comes from this ancient Chinese tradition of banging the hemp plants around you while you're in your bed. And certainly, I guess the way the Chinese have kept selling us hemp through Prohibition is they changed the name to linen. If you guys buy any linen from China, it's actually hemp, but they just don't call it hemp because we might not buy as much. The only the only linen that's not made out of hemp is Irish linen. They actually make that with flax. But all the other hemp on the market is from China, and it's actually hemp. That was their way of selling it to us through the 50s and 60s. But certainly, China has an extensive history using this plant for everything but its intoxicating purposes, actually. There really isn't much of a history of Chinese people making hashish or using hashish, but there is a tradition of them smoking the raw herb somewhat in pipes, I believe, but really that is very small and hasn't gone on for thousands and thousands of years. And speaking of thousands of years, India is probably the world's mecca for cannabis use. Cannabis has not been prohibited in India either, although it is for foreigners somehow. It is legal for people that live in India, but somehow if you're visiting, it's not. But I don't know how commonly enforced that is in today, but certainly for thousands of years there have been a number of different societies and tradition evolve in India around the use of cannabis. We have today sadhus who will march around. Actually, there's a great picture in Chris Bennett's book here of right in the beginning, one of the largest ceremonies in the world. Oh, I'm not going to find it now when I'm looking for it. Oh, there it is. Yeah, I'll never say this right, but the Kumbh Mela is a mass Hindu pilgrimage celebrated every 4 years, and then there's another one that they hold every 144 years, and they smoke a lot of hash at this thing. The last one was held over a period of 45 days in 2007, where over 17 million Hindu pilgrims showed up and were smoking herb. I guess in one day there's 5 million of them hanging out there at one time. And so these are not only some of the oldest traditions in the world, but some of the largest traditions in the world still use cannabis as a regular part of their ceremonies and traditions. And yeah, it's really in Western society where it's prohibited. Well, I guess Western and Asia society, more than anywhere. But back, before 2,000 years ago, there was nowhere in the world.
Thank you.